You are listening to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters.
We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect
huddled
union,
masses yearning to breathe
Consider
free.
that we shall be as a city upon a hill.
that all men and women are created equal.
Give me liberty or give me death.
Nobody's free until everybody's free.
The government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Because history is not just about the past. History is about us, here and now. It explains the world we live in and why things are the way they are. And history gives us insights into how to achieve a better future. So people, let's do this. Hey everyone, welcome to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters. I'm host Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, and this is In the Past Lane for April 14th, 2016. We are coming to you this week from the Nullification Crisis Studios, located somewhere outside of Boston, Massachusetts. You can learn more about me, this podcast, and our guests at our website, inthepastlane.com, and on Facebook and Twitter, where my handle is @InThePastLane. Guiding us along as always is our executive producer, the incomparable Lulu Spencer. Hey good listeners, could you do us a huge favor? If you like this podcast, we would greatly appreciate it if you would head over to iTunes and or Stitcher and left a review. Reviews are so important for pulling in new listeners, and it only takes a few minutes to leave one. Thanks. Well, people, I'm back. Back from where, you ask? Well, the annual convention of the Organization of American Historians, of course. Imagine 1,000 historians gathered in one central location for 4 days. Hoo-wee! It's a wild time, let me tell you. Okay, in all seriousness, for historians of United States history, it's fun, but it's also a big deal. You get to hear about all the new research done by many terrific historians, and you get to bump into a lot of old friends from graduate school who, like me, are now middle-aged historians and college professors. This year, however, I also had the good fortune to meet some of the best historian podcasters out there. That includes Peter Onif and Ed Ayers of Backstory, Nikki Hemmer and Natalia Petrozella of Past Present, and Rebecca Onion of Slate's History of Slavery podcast. And I almost had the chance, we couldn't get our schedules together, I almost had the chance to meet up with historian John Fea, who's the host of the podcast, The Way of Improvement Leads Home. I highly recommend that you check out these podcasts. I will list links to them, plus a few others, in the show notes for this episode. So, what are we up to this week at In the Past Lane? Well, it's upon us. Here in New England, spring is springing, and we're very glad for that. But it's also mid-April, and that means it's tax time. There, I said it. Tax time. Nobody likes tax time. Not even accountants, even though that's where they make most of their money. Around the world, nobody likes to pay taxes. But this aversion to taxes is particularly true in the United States. We have a long history of hating on taxes and the tax man. In fact, as you no doubt remember, much of the resistance to British authority in the decade leading up to the American Revolution centered on taxes. The United States was, in many ways, born under the slogan, "No taxation without representation." Although, given our current political climate, it would seem that some Americans are content to focus only on the first two words of that famous slogan, "No taxation." Well, with this in mind, this week In the Past Lane brings you several features that explore the history of the troubled relationship between Americans and their tax bills. We will start with an interview with historian and writer William Hogeland, author of a terrific book on one of the great tax revolts in American history, the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794. Next in this episode, we take up the story of a little-known tax revolt, the results of which eventually changed the world. Am I exaggerating? Well, you'll have to judge for yourself, but I'll give you a hint. It involves Gandhi, Alice Paul, and Martin Luther King Jr. Our third segment will be a bit of a grab bag of fun and interesting items related to this week's theme of the history of taxes. Okay, people, hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, or is it 9 and 3? Your journey in the past lane begins now. Coming up in a moment, we speak with William Hogeland, author of a terrific book on the Whiskey Rebellion. But before we begin that conversation, let's set it up with a little Early Republic 101. just so we know what's going on. So the Whiskey Rebellion takes place in 1794. That means the United States, the new republic, is just 5 years old at that time. Remember, it's back in 1787 that the Constitutional Convention meets, and that's the body that creates the new, stronger federal national government. In 1788, 1 year later, the Constitution's ratified. In 1789, the new government of the United States, including George Washington as president, takes power. And at this point, 1789, one of the top priorities of the Washington administration was to get the nation on a sound financial footing. The federal government had assumed a huge amount of debt from the individual states, most of it run up during the American Revolutionary War. So Washington's Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, you may have heard of him, he was determined to pay down this debt as quickly as possible. His solution? An excise tax on distilled spirits. But since whiskey was the top-selling form of alcohol at the time, it was called the whiskey tax, and it passed Congress in 1791. And as my father would say, it seemed like a good idea at the time. However, resistance to the tax, especially by Americans living on the western frontier, began immediately. But it really reached a head in 1794. Okay, let's leave it there. Consider yourself up to speed. Let's bring on William Hogeland. We're back. With me now is historian and writer William Hogeland. He is the author of 3 books on the founding period in U.S. history, including Declaration, Founding Finance, and the one we are particularly interested in today, The Whiskey Rebellion. Hogeland also writes for his own blog, williamhogeland.com, and for many other publications, including the New York Times, Atlantic Monthly, Salon, and the Huffington Post. William Hogeland, welcome to In the Past Lane.
Thanks. Good to be here.
I'd like for you to get us started off by offering a brief sketch of the Whiskey Rebellion. What was going on essentially in western Pennsylvania in 1794 that triggers this uprising, which I think everybody has at least heard the phrase, but most people don't really know much about it at all?
It's funny because the phrase is really a misnomer, but it's so appealing, whiskey and rebellion and so forth, that, nobody, including me, can tear themselves away from it as a book title or as a topic. But actually, it was not fundamentally, as it was described at the time by some, about whiskey. It was really a concerted movement centered in western Pennsylvania, as you've said, but also kind of throughout what was then was thought of as the American West. A movement against Alexander Hamilton's comprehensive plan of national finance, which the people who became whiskey rebels, or Hamilton called them whiskey rebels, actually, trying to sort of diminish the critique and just make it sound like it was about whiskey.
Right, the importance of naming something. It reminds me of the argument over what happened in Haymarket in 1886. Was it the Haymarket riot,
right,
which makes the workers look pretty bad, or is it the Haymarket bombing, which makes it a little bit more ambiguous?
Right, it's absolutely in that vein. I mean, he got the first crack at the name, in a way, and that has affected us ever since. It was the people who became rebels were convinced, with good reason, that Hamilton's program, especially the revenue parts of it, acted directly against the majority of poorer people and acted directly in favor of the elites and financiers and so forth, whom Hamilton did want to kind of yoke to the national interest. And so they began to rebel, first by just refusing to pay the tax on whiskey, which was part of Hamilton's plan, a key part, much more key, I think, than we realize when we talk about his more famous accomplishments, the funding of the national debt and the assumption of the state debts in it. But the whiskey tax was a critical linchpin to that plan. And people in western Pennsylvania stopped paying it, but they went beyond just refusal to pay. They carried out kind of what had been long traditional acts of violence against the tax collectors, tarring and feathering and terrorizing and so forth. Is it fair to say that they see themselves as descendants of the Stamp Act rebels and the Sons of Liberty in that regard? Well, that's interesting. It's an interesting connection because it's a funny thing. It's a little fraught. It's a little complicated because, yes, in some ways their rhetoric was very much like that of many of the Stamp Act tax protesters and so forth. And of course there had been, as you're pointing out, there had been this tradition, very recent tradition of resistance to taxation without representation that had brought the country into existence in a sense. And so they felt betrayed in that way. That as if a rebellion against unfair taxes had created this new government that was now unfairly taxing them. So in some ways, yes, I think they felt that they were in that tradition. But it's a funny thing that in another way, the Stamp Act protests were largely, famously confined to sort of the eastern seaports and so forth. And the protesters were among the very elites who now kind of were powerful in government. And so I don't think that the tax ideology of the whiskey rebels is exactly identical to that of those who were protesting taxation without representation during the 1760s and 1770s. It's a kind of an interesting thing that the whiskey rebels had a kind of funnily advanced view of how taxation ought to work. Looking back at it from a 21st century perspective, they were really not in any way anti-tax, so much as they were anti-taxes that they said did not operate in proportion to property. They were really calling for more like, you might even say, progressive taxation or even graduated taxation, right, not unwilling to pay the tax itself.
Right, because on paper, they owned what looked like large chunks of land, but their land was not nearly as valuable as the estates of the people in the East and the elites who were imposing these taxes.
Yeah, and many of the whiskey rebel protesters, in the end, actually were not even landowners at all. There were farmers, of course, involved who were distilling whiskey, but there were also many landless laborers and tenanted farmers, and that situation they felt was getting worse in their region. And of course, without property, or with less and less property, you have less and less stake in the political process in those days. And so, along with the small farmers, the artisanal farmers and so forth, who did distill in that sense artisanally, there were many landless laborers and tenants, and in fact, people who felt that they were being reduced by their richer neighbors to working on the farms of the wealthy. So in certain ways, it was an early kind of labor action as well as a farmer action.
Is it fair to say that these farmers have a different vision of the republic, of what a democracy is, what a republic is, and the country that they hope to see unfold in the future, and that's different in some ways from people like Hamilton and Washington and others who are vested in they're wealthy people, and they're also tied to the power establishment?
Yeah, I think they had a very different vision, and I think what's often misunderstood about them, and Hamilton played a role in this by sort of implying that they just wanted to drink without paying tax. I think they had a very different vision of the future of the country, and it was cogent. This is the thing I think gets misunderstood. It was cogent. They wrote it down in petitions. They said what they wanted, and what they saw was a country, what they wished for, and what they sort of thought they fought for in the Revolution. And many of these people were revolutionary veterans. What they thought they'd fought for was a much more egalitarian society than that envisioned by Hamilton, as you've said, and Washington, and also more egalitarian than that envisioned by Jefferson, too. So I think they're often sometimes cast as a kind of extreme version of Jeffersonian agrarianism, but I think they actually had their own critique and their own ideology, and it was much more egalitarian, much more a sense that people with less property should be voting, that people with no property even should have the vote, by which they meant, of course, they meant white males. They didn't have the egalitarian vision, I think, that we would call egalitarian. But they did believe in disconnecting the franchise from wealth and status. That was their vision.
Can you tell us also, why is whiskey such an important aspect of frontier life? Again, it's not just that people like to drink a lot of whiskey, in which the statistics are fairly amazing when you do see how much people consumed on an annual basis. But whiskey was also much more important in terms of the local economy.
Yeah, they did drink plenty of whiskey. They drank it all the time. But the interesting thing is that where Hamilton, and actually over the generations, Hamilton's biographers following Hamilton in this have wanted to paint the people who became whiskey rebels as just drunks who didn't want to pay tax, that the value of the whiskey, particularly in the West, that part of Western Pennsylvania where the best rye was grown and the best whiskey was made, it had a reputation, even that particular region. Well, the value of that was in the East. It was among people in the East, including elites in the East, because they could get a good price for their whiskey in the East. And not only a good price for the whiskey, but the economics of reducing a certain amount of rye to a portable liquid form that you could then haul over the mountains with fewer mules and so forth, created it was really their only way of getting a hold of any cash, which was very scarce. It was really, for some of these small farmers, their only cash crop, and their only way of gaining a purchase at all on development. They wanted economic development too.
Right.
They just wanted it more on their own terms, and one of their ways of getting that was to get a little bit ahead by selling their whiskey over the mountains to the east.
Right, and as you say, it was a heck of a lot easier to take a couple gallons of whiskey on a mule over the mountains than to take hundreds of pounds of grain. It just made no sense. So really it's the one way they can get cash, and it's really a fundamental part of their day-to-day economic life, and also, like you said, their future, their aspirations for something more.
Yes, I think that's one of the interesting things about this whole struggle is, and actually the historiography of it too is interesting, because some people admire the Whiskey Rebels or the whole culture that they came from. I think some progressive historians look at it as like, it's less capitalist, less competitive, more barter oriented, and so forth. And while there might be elements of truth in that, I think it's even more interesting to realize the degree to which they felt kind of reduced at times by federal policy to a barter economy. They were trying to get ahead as well, and they needed to grow and they needed to develop and so forth. But they just wanted more. They wanted more equal access to those tools of economic development, and more equal access to the political process as well, and to credit, of course, important for growth.
Yeah, we can romanticize the rural simplicity and the barter economy, but most people out there, I often say to my students, the only people who are subsistence farmers are angry about it because they'd much rather be tied into the market. And so, these farmers, I think, like a lot of Americans, they want roads, they want functioning courts, they want access to credit. They're not reveling in their isolation. They're working really, really hard to overcome their isolation. And they see the fact that the elites have the power and are directing resources not towards roads, but towards other projects as really fundamentally unfair.
That's a good point.
Another question I had was, shifting the focus now towards away from the rebels for a moment to think about how does this emerging rebellion, this resistance to new federal authority, the government's only recently been formed, how does this play in the Washington administration and between Washington, Hamilton, and other advisors? And this has to be a fairly terrifying development, but also one they want to move carefully on.
Yeah, again, it was more, in that sense, more important than a lot of people think. In that, in the end, to jump ahead of your question a little bit, in the end, people may not be aware that George Washington personally led an enormous number of troops, more than he had taken into the Battle of Yorktown, for example, to sort of effectively end the Revolutionary War, against American citizens deemed to be in a state of rebellion in the Western country. So they raised troops, and they wrote out, in the end, what the Washington administration did about it was, people say sort of suppress the Whiskey Rebellion, but I'm always sort of careful to say suppress really all of Western Pennsylvania at that point. They did door-kicking mass arrests. They held people on no charge indefinitely, people against whom they knew actually explicitly, and you can see this in the correspondence, they knew they had no evidence against, but the idea was to create a model, a lesson, create examples, and so forth.
Yeah, sort of the low-level shock and awe of the populace to say, don't do this again.
Yeah, not so low-level for the people involved. It was pretty shocking and awe-inspiring, and they extracted loyalty oaths and so forth, and really occupied Western Pennsylvania for quite some time in order to establish national sovereignty there in fact, rather than just on paper. But within the administration, there was definitely some disagreement. Randolph, who I guess had taken over as Secretary of State when Jefferson left, was much more interested in negotiating and trying to avoid the kind of crackdown that actually ensued. And Hamilton, and this should surprise nobody, Hamilton was very much in favor of as big a crackdown as could possibly be brought about in defense of his policies.
Yeah, he had no problem.
And Washington essentially agreed in the end.
Yeah, he had no problem with power. Very little doubt when it came to exercising power, that's for certain.
Yeah, that's right.
So they ultimately decide, against Randolph's urgings and others, to take action. And this is a really big deal because if you go back to the American Revolution and read the rhetoric of the Founding Fathers and the Revolutionary War, it was all about, the mobilization of power by the government against the people and this fear of militarized power against the populace that really looms large in people's minds, way more than say in the 21st century. So they knew that they were in some ways playing with fire or with their reputations as representatives of the people. This had to weigh kind of heavily on them.
Yeah, I don't feel it weighed heavily on Hamilton. I don't think he was concerned, really, about that issue. I don't think he had any real doubt or any real sort of second guessing of himself about whether this was justified and whether it would be effective. I think he was less concerned with that, and possibly that's the reason. He was then and remains, in that sense, a controversial figure. He was really, they were all concerned with their personal reputations and their legacies in that way of the 18th century elite male, but I don't think he really cared what people thought about some of that stuff. Washington, it's very interesting how it played out for Washington because, I just said he led the troops into Western Pennsylvania. He led the troops into Western Pennsylvania with Hamilton by his side, the Treasury Secretary, not the Secretary of War. Very interesting. Hamilton was not going to miss this expedition. But then Washington turned back and left it to Hamilton to kind of carry out. He turned back at Bedford, Pennsylvania, and went back to Philadelphia, which was the capital then, and left Hamilton and General Lee to do the work of actually suppressing the entire populace there. And in that sense, I think he gets off the hook a bit, because Hamilton was willing to take that rap, and Washington was not. So while Washington sent letters on his way back, always reminding Hamilton, don't, force supply from the people and make sure you obey the laws and so forth, he had no effective oversight. And there's a sense in which he really didn't want to. He knew what had to be done, but he didn't want to have that sort of thing attached to his reputation.
Right, and a very important political division of labor, so to speak.
Yeah.
So how does the Whiskey Rebellion ultimately end? Washington mobilizes this force of well over 10,000 troops. They head out to western Pennsylvania, and then they begin mass arrests. The actual standing rebellion sort of fizzles out, but they go after the perpetrators and rumored perpetrators, and at least a few dozen people are arrested. But ultimately, what's the end? Yeah,
ultimately, at the end, in sort of broad historical terms, the end is kind of like, fizzles out. I mean, they brought a few prisoners back from the West, marched them over the mountains, but they paraded them in the streets of Philadelphia in front of cheering, mobs of people as sort of trophies of victory. In the end, they could not get indictments, and in very few cases where they did get indictments, they couldn't get convictions. A couple of people were convicted who really didn't have much to do with it in the first place. And Washington ended up pardoning them, which, of course, attaches very positively to his reputation. The idea being we established order, but we're not taking revenge against these people. In another way, I think, though, Hamilton was not interested so much in getting convictions of indicted criminals. I think what he really wanted to do was have a reason to go sit on all of western Pennsylvania, which was where all the radicalism against his policies had become centered. And so if you look east and you look at the sort of the due process part of it, it's a story in which, a president acted with clemency and yet established order. If you look west at what happened to the people there and what Hamilton was really up to with the arrests and the detentions and all that sort of stuff and the loyalty oaths and so forth that went on after that, it's a different story. It's much more a story of finding ways to assert authority without actually going through the legal process.
Two different styles. Well, I have one last overall question, which is a big one, always, but especially these days. Why do you think conflicts over taxes mark so much of American history? I mean, in a way, the Revolution is based on, to some degree, on resistance to taxation. Then there's Shays' Rebellion, then the Whiskey Rebellion, and then many, many others, some not even with the explicit invocation of taxes, but taxes are at the heart of the conflict. What is it about Americans and their taxes?
Yeah, that is a big one. Well, of course, as we were talking about earlier, regarding the Stamp Act and so forth, and the fact that the country as a unified group of colonies and then states was brought together largely in resistance to policies that kept sort of distilled around taxation, must play a role in how we've gone on thinking about taxation as an exercise of tyranny. And so I think there's a kind of a misunderstanding that may have started very early about what the basis of those protests of the 1760s and 1770s against taxation without representation, what they were really all about. So there's this kind of bumpy road via taxation that gets us independent and then, in the end, creates a taxing power in a national government. And I think all the way through that process, and then, of course, how we look at it looking back, we've just always been sort of confused about what the rights and wrongs of taxation might be. And it always seems to always strike Americans as an unreasonable assertion of some sort of tyrannical authority to collect tax, even though you are now represented theoretically in government. Mm-hmm. There still seems to cling to taxation this particular, it's like a lightning rod for everything about government that we might mistrust or dislike or be suspicious of.
Yeah, it's often, I think, historically and also more recently with polling and surveys of people, it seems that it's really not so much about how much people are paying, the actual dollar amount. Taxes seem to represent something, whether it's a broad idea of overreaching government or the notion that some people aren't paying anything and that the heart and soul of the country are paying all the taxes. If you're a pacifist, then you don't like how much goes to the military. If you're conservative, you don't like how much goes to welfare. So it becomes this kind of all-purpose mobilizing issue, and it has really, really deep roots.
Yeah, I think some of the things you're raising continue to this day, obviously, like the sense that some people aren't paying their fair share contributes. But we don't know if we could actually get it so that everybody was paying a fair share, whether Americans would sort of then be okay with paying taxes, or if it's just an inveterate issue.
It probably is the latter. That's my suspicion. And I guess actually have one final question, which is, have you filed your taxes yet? It's almost April 15th. Yeah, I think we have till April 18th this year because of the way that the date falls.
Oh, well, that's a relief to me to know that, because I have not filed yet, but it's all sitting there on the desk ready to go.
Yeah, all right. Well, I always consider walking out of my car to my accountant's office and handing him a pile of papers and saying, please make this all go away, to be one of the better days of the year. Even though I have to pay for that, it's just an enormous relief.
Yes, it's always good to get through it.
All right, great. Well, William Hogeland, it's been a pleasure to speak with you about the Whiskey Rebellion and taxes and all that. We want to thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It's been great.
Okay. William Hogeland is the author of 3 books on early American history, including The Whiskey Rebellion, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and the Frontier Rebels Who Challenged America's Newfound Sovereignty. You can learn more about him at his website, williamhogeland.com, and at our website, inthepastlane.com. We'll be right back. Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. The Whiskey Rebellion certainly deserves to be a better-known chapter in American history. One of the key takeaways from this event, and pretty much any tax revolt in American history, is that fights over taxes usually have very little to do with money. That is, most people ultimately are not concerned about how much a particular new tax will cost them. They get fired up by what the tax means, by what the tax seems to stand for. Whether that's the sense that the government is being too intrusive in the lives of individual citizens, or that the government wastes too much tax revenue, or that the revenue derived from the new tax will be used for a policy or a program that they disagree with. And we can see this in the original tax revolt in American history, the years leading up to the American Revolution, starting with the Stamp Act of 1765, and that's the act that imposed a wide range of taxes on goods and services. The American colonists began to denounce British taxes as oppressive and unjust. However, if you examine closely the struggle over taxes from 1765 to 1773, that's the year of the Boston Tea Party, 2 facts emerge. First, Americans really weren't all that oppressed by taxes. In fact, they paid the lowest taxes compared to other British subjects in England and other British colonies. Second, the basis of the American argument against taxes shifted a lot in these years, moving from the vague but very compelling "no taxation without representation" slogan to basically saying no taxes at all by the time of the Boston Tea Party. What happened in the colonies then was not a tax revolt per se, but rather a revolt against British authority that was imposing the taxes. Americans had outgrown the old relationship of mother country and children-like colonies. They wanted more independence. They wanted, if you want to go with the metaphor, to be treated more like adult members of the British Empire. And when Britain refused, it became common sense, as Tom Paine put it, that America should throw off British rule and become an independent nation. Whereupon, of course, they could begin arguing with each other about taxes. We'll be right back. In the Past Lane is brought to you by ASH SFCTH, the American Society of High School Football Coaches Teaching History. We're 4,000 members strong, and you can find us in schools from Boston to Berkeley. And we're committed to treating history like a meal ticket. You can learn more about us at our website, www.letswatchanothervideo.com. The American Society of High School Football Coaches Teaching History. Sucking the joy out of history, one worksheet at a time. Hut hut! We've just gone deep into a famous tax revolt in American history, the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794, one that involved thousands of people, and in a very real way posed a serious threat to the new nation. Now let's turn our attention to a little-known one-man tax revolt that occurred 170 years ago, back in 1846. It involved, if you can believe it, Gandhi, Alice Paul, and Martin Luther King Jr. Okay, that's obviously not true, since none of these social justice activists were alive back in 1846. But this tax revolt did, eventually, have a tremendous impact on all 3 of them, and the movements they led. This curious incident lasted only one day in the summer of 1846. It involved no violence, no militia, no proclamations, no tarring and feathering, none of that. Indeed, it involved just one individual, a quiet intellectual named Henry David Thoreau. Now, at the time, Thoreau was a largely unknown writer. His most famous work, Walden, would not be published for another 8 years. But in July 1846, Thoreau had more on his mind than writing. He was thinking about war. Just 2 months earlier, the U.S. Congress had declared war on Mexico. That decision, like nearly every other occasion that this nation has gone to war, proved deeply divisive among the American people. Now, Americans who believed in manifest destiny and expansion, they welcomed the war. They knew the United States would win, and in the process, seize a huge chunk of Mexican territory. Opponents of the war, however, a group that included a little-known Whig congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln, they denounced the war for 2 key reasons. First, they believed, and the historical record pretty much supports them, that the alleged clash between the United States and Mexican troops that President Polk and Congress cited as the justification for the war, this had been instigated by the United States. In other words, America had picked a fight with a weaker foe, knowing it would win and that the victory would result in the acquisition of a vast tract of Mexican territory. Virtuous republics, said these critics of the war, did not engage in such behavior. That was the stuff of ruthless monarchs. The second reason they opposed the war was centered on the controversy that dominated antebellum politics: slavery. Opponents of slavery feared that any new territory acquired from Mexico would soon become slave states. And they were adamantly opposed to the expansion of slavery. They believed that bottling slavery up in the states where it currently existed would lead to its slow extinction. But if the number of slave states actually grew, well, that would give slavery a new life for generations to come. This opposition was neatly summed up by Thoreau's friend and mentor, Ralph Waldo Emerson. He said, "The United States will conquer Mexico, but it will be as the man swallows the arsenic, which brings him down in turn. Mexico will poison us." And he was right. The U.S. swallowed the northern half of Mexico, and in the ensuing political controversies over that territory regarding slavery, that led eventually to civil war. So that's what was on Thoreau's mind on July 24th, 1846, when he was out running errands, and up walked a man named Sam Staples, the local tax collector. Staples informed Thoreau that he needed to pay his poll tax, and not just for the year 1846, but also for the previous 5 years. Now, a poll tax is a nominal tax, kind of like a head tax, that citizens in many states paid annually, usually about $1 or less. Thoreau refused to pay it, citing his opposition to the Mexican War. He would not contribute money that would, either directly or indirectly, support Massachusetts militiamen fighting against Mexico. Staples responded by placing Thoreau under arrest and led him off to jail. The following morning, someone, presumably his aunt, quietly paid Thoreau's back taxes and secured his release. And that was it. The story of the eccentric Thoreau's night in jail for refusing to pay his taxes probably went no further than the borders of his town of Concord, Massachusetts. However, the experience left a deep mark on Thoreau. It prompted him to think deeply and seriously about the rights of citizens to oppose laws and policies they believed to be unjust. Thoreau gradually worked up his thoughts into a public lecture that he delivered in 1848. 1 year later, he published the talk in a journal under the title Resistance to Civil Government. In this essay, he summed up the central question as follows: unjust laws exist. Shall we be content to obey them? Or shall we endeavor to amend them and obey them until we have succeeded? Or shall we transgress them at once? In other words, a citizen confronted by an unjust law had 3 options. 1, do nothing. 2, obey the law but work to change it, even if it took years or even decades. And 3, break the law to make a moral point and challenge authorities to justify their unjust law. Thoreau said the third option was the only one for those who believed in justice. And he used the example of his one-man tax revolt to illustrate the point. Thoreau's essay, which gradually came to be known simply as civil disobedience, drew very little attention. It was greatly overshadowed by Walden, the masterpiece he published a few years later. But, as is sometimes the case with writers and artists, civil disobedience began to garner attention long after Thoreau died in 1862. In fact, it was over 40 years later, in 1907, when a young attorney from India being held in a South African jail read the essay. Mohandas Gandhi had been arrested for his civil rights activism on behalf of non-whites in South Africa, and he was blown away by the essay, by what he later called its incisive logic. Gandhi later said of Thoreau that he was, quote, one of the greatest and most moral men America has ever produced. And he later named his nonviolent movement to free India from British colonial rule civil disobedience, in honor of Thoreau. Just a few years later, in the mid-19-teens, Alice Paul was a leading figure in the women's rights movement in the United States. She too had read Thoreau and was impressed with the moral logic of his nonviolent civil disobedience philosophy. So when parades and petitions failed to gain any action from Congress to grant women the right to vote, she launched in January 1917 a campaign of women picketing the White House. They remained nonviolent and resolute, even though they had to endure violence, jail, and forced feedings when they later declared a hunger strike. But in the end, their campaign of civil disobedience led to the passage and ratification of the 19th Amendment granting women the right to vote in 1920. And then, just 14 years later, in 1944, Thoreau's essay wielded a similar influence on another future civil rights activist, Martin Luther King Jr. He read the essay over and over again as a college student, and he later wrote as follows. Here, in this courageous New Englander's refusal to pay his taxes and his choice of jail rather than support a war that would spread slavery's territory into Mexico, I made my first contact with the theory of nonviolent resistance. I became convinced that non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as cooperation with good. The teachings of Thoreau came alive in our civil rights movement. Suffice it to say that Gandhi, Paul, and King are only 3 examples of social justice activists who were influenced by Thoreau's essay on civil disobedience. So there you have it. A little-known one-day, one-man tax revolt in 1846 failed to change any law, but it did inspire an essay on nonviolent civil disobedience that influenced freedom struggles around the world. It's yet another example of history's unpredictable outcomes. Who knew taxes could be so interesting? We'll be right back. Hey there, people. I want to add one more piece to that last segment on Thoreau, taxes, and nonviolent civil disobedience. Think of it as a troubling postscript. Let's talk about the poll tax. That's the nominal annual head tax that many states levied on each male citizen. As we just learned, the poll tax in Massachusetts played an indirect role in establishing a key idea and tactic used in many civil rights movements around the world. But 50 years after Thoreau spent a night in jail, the poll tax was being imposed all across the American South, and it came with a very important stipulation. Anyone who failed to pay their poll tax was ineligible to vote. Now, the goal of this poll tax was plain to everyone. It was to deprive African Americans of the right to vote. Even though the poll tax was generally $1, that was a lot of money for poor black sharecroppers to pay. When combined with other practices, like the grandfather clause and the literacy test, plus the brutal violence meted out by the KKK, the poll tax played a key role in disenfranchising more than 90% of black citizens in the American South. This was the foundation of the Jim Crow system of oppression that the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s took aim at. In addition to achieving the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the civil rights movement also won ratification of the 24th Amendment to the Constitution that prohibited the poll tax. See what I mean? Taxes aren't just taxes. And that's even true of minor ones like poll taxes. Throughout American history, taxes have been tied to crucial issues related to equality, democracy, and social justice. Keep that in mind as tax day approaches. Don't go anywhere, people. We'll be right back. Okay, it's time to round off this episode of In the Past Lane with some fun odds and ends regarding taxes. First, let me give you a reason to like taxes. Really, I mean it, it's true. If you choose to celebrate the filing of your taxes, or maybe just maybe, if you're lucky, the receipt of a tax refund, with an alcoholic beverage of your choice, keep this in mind. You can thank your taxes. It's true. Prohibition was repealed, praise the Lord, in 1933. But Congress was not convinced to make this move by arguments that hardworking Americans have a right to a cold one at the end of their workday. No. Advocates of repeal said ending prohibition would help struggling farmers, and it would boost federal tax revenues, which was desperately needed to fund New Deal relief programs. So you make alcohol legal, you can tax it, and you bring a lot more revenue into the federal coffers. So taxes were a key argument in overturning prohibition. See, in a way, there is an upside to taxes, and I'll drink to that. And now let's turn to some wise and witty words from history about taxes. Probably the most quoted person on taxes is Benjamin Franklin. He said way back when, "In this world nothing can be certain except death and taxes." A more positive take on taxes comes from Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. He said, "Taxes are what we pay for civilized society." And if you're struggling over your tax forms right now, this may give you some consolation. Albert Einstein, clearly one of the most brilliant men ever to live, said the following: "The hardest thing in the world to understand is the income tax." Senator Russell Long also had some wise words about taxes and about the different ways we perceive them. He said as follows, "A tax loophole is something that benefits the other guy. If it benefits you, it's tax reform." And let's end with the words of that famous humorist Will Rogers. He said, "The income tax has made more liars out of the American people than golf." How true. Well, people, I hate to say it, but we are out of time. I want to thank you for listening, and I encourage you to weigh in with comments, questions, and suggestions via Twitter and Facebook, and at our website, inthepastlane.com. At this site, you'll also find links, essays, images, and further reading suggestions related to all the topics we've talked about in this episode. And you can learn more about our guests, correspondents, and other contributors. And speaking of social media, In the Past Lane is an independently produced podcast, so we rely on loyal listeners like you to help spread the word. So if you like this podcast, please follow us on Facebook and Twitter. And please, oh please, take a moment to write a review at iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you access this podcast. Reviews are incredibly important for pulling in new listeners. Thanks. In the Past Lane has been made possible by the hard work and dedication of many people. They include technical advisors Holly Hunt and Jesse Anderson, photographer John Buckingham, graphic designer Maggie Salucci, and our intrepid executive producer Lulu Spencer. Special thanks also to Jay Graham for creating the intro music for this podcast, and to the Free Music Archive for providing the rest of the music for this episode. I'm In the Past Lane's host, Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, reminding you that history explains our world, so let's pay attention to it. Thanks for listening. We hope you'll join us next week for another journey in the Past Lane. Lulu, you get the last word. Let's hear it.
How did I get this job?
SBI, Snoring Beagle International.